Ever wonder if a book's worth reading? If it's worth the money even buying it? Or if it's even worth all that hype? What about a TV show or a movie? You just can't trust the internet these days. I'm Katie, and I'm not afraid to spoil the books and the movies for you. Welcome to Spoiler Alert, and I'll spoil anything. Welcome to Episode 3 of Spoiler Alert. Are you ready? Because we're about to finish the Afterlife Investigation series. The final book is called The Occupant. If you haven't been here for the last 2 episodes, I highly suggest you go back and listen to those 2 instead, and then come back and listen to this one. Otherwise, you're going to be completely lost. Okay, if you remember anything about the way the last book ended, Professor Barlow and Jake chased after what they thought was Elizabeth in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, because they're smart. And when they came back, the car was on fire, along with all of Corvine's research. And just to be sure that they knew exactly who did it, the occupant was standing on top of the car. With absolutely nothing and hitchhiking, they hitchhike down the middle of nowhere in the middle of the Michigan woods and are eventually picked up by some really nice dude who takes them to a McDonald's at a rest stop. So this nice stranger drops them off at a rest stop that has a McDonald's in it and even buys them breakfast. But without money, a car, or literally anything, they're kind of stuck. So Barlow does pretty much the only thing he can think of, and despite her warnings, he calls Janie Corvine for help. Obviously she's pissed off, but she's completely unsurprised. She picks them up from the rest stop an hour later, and she takes them back to her trailer where she lives. Janie, in no uncertain terms, tells off Barlow for being stupid and tells him that they're probably going to have to kill Elizabeth to get the occupant out, and that he's just going to have to live with it. Obviously, Jake isn't cool with this because it's his girlfriend, but, I mean, what are you going to do? So, Jane tells them to go to sleep, and she's going to try and figure out where Millsbourne is. So, despite being a pretty prickly person, Jane gives Jake and Barlow some food. She gives Barlow a cigarette. And in their talking, they realize that Jake and Elizabeth had gotten freaky. And that the reason why the occupant possessed Elizabeth is because she's pregnant. So, basically, Elizabeth is going to give birth to the occupant. She tells Jake and Barlow to get some rest, and she's going to go out, talk to some people in town, try to find out where the heck this Millsbourne is. She comes back and says she found this old guy who probably knows where it is, but he's not talking, and she's had no luck. So she goes to bed to get some rest because she's going to drag Barlow and Jake out into the middle of the woods to try and hunt down. Anyways, Jane's going to drag Barlow and Jake out into the middle of the woods to try and find Millsbourne. As they're sleeping, Jane hears something. She opens her front door, gun in hand, to find their trailer completely surrounded by townies. One of these men, his name is Eli Lancaster. You know, like Enid and Elizabeth. Obviously, this does not get past Barlow, and he tries to talk Eli into telling them about Millsbourne. You know, he's like, hey, this is what's going on with us. The student's been possessed. What do you know? What's going on? We know something's going on. Eli tells them to leave it alone, that the person has gone hiking, that she's dead, and just stay away from Millsbourne. Forget all about it. Don't come back. Obviously, the gang is completely undeterred, and in the morning, they pack up and they head off into the middle of nowhere. Jane basically weighs Jake down with like most of their gear, so that way in case they do have to kill Elizabeth, he's got like a handicap. And then she also teaches Barlow how to fire a gun. He's really bad at it, but she teaches him how to use it in case they need to protect themselves from those people who were trying to scare them out of the woods, or even from the occupant. But I mean, are guns really going to do any good against the occupant? It's already not alive? I don't know. So they hike pretty much forever. Barlow's skittish, and he's seeing things pretty much everywhere he goes. and he's pissing off Jake and Jane. But that night, they see a steeple off into the distance, but they decide not to approach the town of Millsbourne and camp for the night. Jake and Jane start to pitch the tent, but it becomes abundantly clear that Barlow is pretty much inept in anything that includes the outdoors. So they send him off to collect firewood and kindling so that way they can have a fire that night. In the process of doing so, Barlow comes across a severed hand. As he's staring in terror at the severed hand, completely convinced that he's just seeing things again, a wolf comes out of nowhere, grabs the hand, and leaves. The three of them are like, what on earth is that? So they decide, you know what, it's probably best for us to scout around, see how many bodies there are, see who did it, what happened, and maybe if there's any place safe for us to pitch a tent in the town. Spoiler alert, there's not. The following is pretty graphic. The rest of the book is going to be pretty graphic. If you have a weak stomach, just consider this good. So, as they walk towards Millbourne, I'm trying to think how to explain this to you guys. So they walk towards Millbourne. It's like walking through hell. Like, literally walking through hell. As they walk to the steeple, the trees and the ground and basically everything is covered in gore. We're talking blood, we're talking internal organs, we're talking limbs. One person's head has been decapitated and is stuck on a branch. It's missing its eyes. Freaked out, they finally make it to the chapel. I mean, obviously, Elizabeth, possessed by the Occupant, was the one who did that. And those dead people are that group of people that tried to intimidate Jane, Barlow, and Jake from going to Millsbourne. It's still really gruesome. It's pretty gross. And Ambrose Ibsen's pretty good at describing things, so it's nauseating. Anyway, so they get to the chapel and they hear something there. And that's where they find Eli Lancaster, who has a literal bite out of his side. Eli tells them, hey, the Occupant knows you're here. It's been leading you here the whole time. When it's ready for you, it's gonna come to you. You're not gonna have to search for her. And as the sun goes down, it's getting closer and closer because she doesn't come out during the day. At night, she'll come for you, and you better be ready. Then he dies in a very melodramatic way. So Shaken, the gang heads back to camp, and they're just like, what do we do now? So they eat, they rest, take shifts sleeping. Then they hear something outside of their tent. When they go out, it's Elizabeth. I mean, obviously, it's Elizabeth. Everyone else is dead, right? I mean, it's gotta be Elizabeth. So basically the Occupant's like trying to scare them. It doesn't really say anything, but it's pregger. It's like super preggo. Her stomach is huge, like massive. Obviously, like this pregnancy is progressing a lot faster than a regular pregnancy, and it doesn't look like Elizabeth anymore. Like her face is just inhuman. And Jake, because he's stupid, tries to talk her, like, hey, you can fight it, come back to me. Basically, things head south really fast. Jake tries to get up close and personal to the Occupant. The Occupant attacks Jake. Jane comes to Jake's rescue because apparently we have to save stupid people now. And Jane ends up in a tussle with the Occupant. All of a sudden, it starts pouring rain. But not just any rain. Boiling rain. And when I say boiling, I mean like the temperature boiling. It is melting holes into their tent. It sizzles as it hits the ground, and it's burning Jake and Barlow. So they take off, but as they're running blindly through the woods, through the fog, they get separated. Barlow can hear the voices of the dead emanating from the Occupant as he flees. Barlow comes across some abandoned buildings from what used to be Millsbourne, and he decides that he's going to hide in one of those buildings, which really isn't a bad idea. As he comes to one of those buildings, he runs into the guy that Jane tried to convince to tell her about Mill. This guy is the guy that Jane tried to convince to tell her about Millsbourne. His name's Paul. According to Paul, in the 1860s, a man by the name of Joseph Lancaster worked in the mines in Millsbourne. One day, when there was a cave-in in the mines, Joseph Lancaster was trapped. Unlike many miners before him, Joseph Lancaster should have died in the cave-in. And it really just wasn't uncommon in the 1800s for men to die in mining cave-ins. However, the occupant, or malignant spirit as they called it, made contact with Joseph Lancaster and promised him that he would live and promised him wealth in exchange for one of his daughters. As disgusting as it sounds, apparently Joseph Lancaster took the occupant up on its offer. One day, after the townsfolk had already held a funeral for Joseph Lancaster, he walks out of the woods completely fine. Of course, the townspeople were nice, but they were really suspicious. He should have been dead. Joseph had a single child, Sarah Lancaster, who was a teenager, and in the 1860s, she was pretty close to marrying age. Since the accident, Joseph can no longer work in the mines, so he takes odd jobs and does other things to pay his bills. But late at night, he still takes trips up to the mines, sometimes with his daughter in tow. To quote Ambrose Ibsen, it would come out later that he was bringing her there to the very shaft where he had been buried, preparing her for some kind of big event. He called it the communion of the abyss, and it involved the two of them spending time near the mines on an almost nightly basis. And then one day the girl just up and vanished. Joseph acted concerned, pled ignorance, but those who knew about his little trips into the hills did not believe him. Soon, even the girl's loved ones start vanishing. Her mom, some friends, a teacher, all just start disappearing. People in the town are like, okay, this probably has to do something with the fact that Joseph's been acting freaky weird. So one day they follow him up to the mines, and that's where they find the girl. Sarah Lancaster is knocked up. She has solid black eyes, and she has been eating all of those people who had been disappearing. That's right, eating. Because all this book was missing at this point was cannibalism. People freaked out, obviously. They dragged Joseph off into the woods and they killed him. Then they filled the hole. So basically this Joseph Lancaster is a pretty immoral dude. He decides to bargain his daughter for his own life and for this mythical wealth that the occupant's never going to give him. Then he comes home, knocks up his daughter, lets her get possessed by the occupant, and then starts feeding her loved ones. Can you imagine being this little girl? So obviously the townspeople freak out. They drag Joseph out of his home, they kill him, and then they decide it's time to kill the girl. Whatever that thing is cannot be born. So they fill the hole where the girl is just full of burning refuse, and they keep it burning for days until they're absolutely positive that the girl is dead. If you were thinking that was the end, you'd be wrong, because soon the town's water supply that had once been clear and perfect is now ruined, poisoned, bad. The town empties out after that, but it's not the end. In the 1970s, stories start circling about this black-eyed being that is wandering the woods because awesome. The townspeople basically decide that as long as the Lancaster mine keeps going, that thing in the woods is never going to go away. In a tradition that even some clergy members honored, they would kill any female born to the Lancaster line. Obviously this fell out of practice, but the Lancasters decided to split. They spread out across the country, some of them changed their names, and they basically disappeared. Present day, Eli Lancaster has one sister, and she's mentally ill. One day, she gets pregnant with a girl. She decides to kill the little girl, but Eli stops her and takes the little girl, Elizabeth. And because I like the way that Ambrose Ibsen kind of recaps all of this, I'm going to read it to you. This thing we called the Occupant was some kind of malignant spirit that had first been sighted in the 1860s thanks to Joseph Lancaster. It should have been a wandering, impotent thing relegated to the Michigan woods, and it would have been if not for the work of Dr. W.R. Corvine. In the 1970s, mourning the loss of his wife and daughter, Corvine had invited his niece Jane to a cabin in the Hiawatha region to establish a link to supernatural forces. Desperate for results, his experiments began to degenerate into madness. It was only after abandoning all ethics and experimenting with untested drugs that his subject, Jane, had made contact with the only supernatural presence in the region. The occupant, having wandered aimlessly for a century, was drawn to Jane and given a temporary refuge during the doctor's nightly sessions. Jane, however, wasn't a Lancaster, and she could not fulfill the promise that Joseph Lancaster had made 100 years prior, and so, abandoning Jane to a sanitarium, he set out looking for someone who could fill the role of host. Somewhere along the line, and probably due to a nudge from the occupant, Corvine learned of Millsbourne, Michigan, found out about the Lancaster curse, and then started looking for descendant of a doomed line. He struck gold when taking a post at Jaith Asylum in the 80s. He was introduced to Enid Lancaster. Considering his renown as a physician, Corvine could have worked most anywhere. That he'd chosen the Ohio Asylum, where a descendant of the Lancaster line was admitted, was no coincidence. Out of nowhere, the occupant appears and attacks Paul. While the occupant is eating Paul, Barlow escapes and he just takes off because that's the thing you do. I think I like this filter better. We're going to stick with this one. So as Barlow is just booking it, he is obviously being pursued by the occupant. The occupant gets up close and personal with him, and he shoots a hole in the side of the occupant. And then, like, all of a sudden, the occupant is not possessing Elizabeth anymore, and it's Elizabeth who's crying in pain. But then the occupant comes back, and Barlow just takes off. Like, he's like, nope, not, nope. This sticks in Barlow's mind, but as he's running, he falls and he hits his head, and he gets knocked out. When he comes to, it's daytime. Wandering around and completely lost in the woods, he accidentally stumbles upon the mine from the story of Sarah Lancaster and Joseph Lancaster. And down there is Elizabeth, possessed by the occupant. Barlow stumbles through the woods until he finds the tent, where luckily both Jane and Jake are. He sleeps for a while, and then he tells them everything he learned, and also about how the occupant kind of left Elizabeth for a minute after it was hurt. They talk Jane into this plan that's pretty risky, and I honestly was surprised that she agreed to it. But they devise a plan, and it's not bad. The plan is for Jake to lure the occupant to the church building that they found in Millsbourne. Once there, they will tie the occupant down and torture it until it leaves Elizabeth's body and is forced to go to Jane's body. Once the occupant is in Jane's body, they plan on carrying Elizabeth out of the woods, and then eventually the occupant is going to leave Jane because she's not a suitable host. The idea is that because Jane's not a suitable host, once Elizabeth is out of the woods, the occupant simply is just going to leave Jane's and be stuck wandering in the woods forever, and then Jane can leave the woods safely. Needless to say, this is not how things work out. Once they put their plan into action, they torture Elizabeth a little bit, the occupant leaves the body, Jake starts to carry Elizabeth out of the church, but then Jane starts making this choking noise, and Barlow, distracted, goes to Jane instead of helping Jake carry Elizabeth out, and watches the occupant kill Jane. Then the occupant goes back to Elizabeth and possesses her. Barlow tries to kill Elizabeth, but Barlow draws his gun on Elizabeth, but Jake gets in the way right as Barlow pulls the trigger. The bullet nicks one of Jake's arteries, and Jake dies. Torn up, Barlow drags Elizabeth to the mine where everything started. Using his only weapon left, a pocket knife, he beheads Elizabeth, throws the corpse into the mine, and then leaves the woods. Before the occupant dies, it gives Barlow one final message. It's never over. Barlow heads home and is fired from the university, and he couch surfs with some friends for a while until he eventually gets a position at a university with benefits. It's a great job, and he meets a girl. They are madly in love, and they spend the night together almost every night. I'm gonna save the rest for another clip. Hold on. He sleeps with the lights on almost every night, but other than that, things are pretty great. His girlfriend tells him that her last name is Dennis and that her family history is a little muddy, but they come from somewhere in Michigan. She tells him that her family was run out of Michigan and that their last name used to be Lancaster. He's shaken, but he brushes it off. She then goes home to visit her parents, but when he doesn't hear back from her the next day, he decides to call her cell phone and finds that she forgot her purse there. In the purse he finds 1, her cell phone, 2, an entire unused month of birth control, which is strange because they spend the night together almost every night, and 3, a note that says, "The door is open, it's already too late." That's it. That's the end of the series. If you enjoyed this episode of Spoiler Alert, please be sure to like and then subscribe as well.